When you think of Europe, images of progressive values and multicultural societies likely come to mind. But beneath this polished exterior lies a more troubling reality: racism. Across several European countries, racial discrimination and xenophobia are everyday experiences for many minorities. In this video, we'll take a deeper dive into 10 countries where racism remains deeply rooted. As we reveal each nation's story, you'll gain insight into the complex racial dynamics at play. Stick around to the end to understand why these countries rank among the most racist in Europe. Let's get started. Country 1. Germany. Germany is often regarded as one of the most progressive countries in Europe, particularly in terms of its economy and social policies. Yet, despite its international image, racism remains a pressing issue. People of African, Turkish, and Middle Eastern descent frequently report facing systemic discrimination, from finding employment to dealing with the police. The hurdles minorities face are often overwhelming. In fact, nearly 40% of black men report being racially profiled by law enforcement, an alarming statistic in a country that prides itself in its democratic values. The problem is not just about daily discrimination. There's a culture of silence that further complicates efforts to address racism. Those who speak out against racial injustice often face societal backlash, and discussions around racism are downplayed or ignored. While the German government acknowledges racism as a threat to democracy, the societal response to these issues has been slow and, at times, inadequate. For Germany, confronting these issues is not just about policy but about shifting the cultural mindset that has allowed racism to persist for so long. Germany's unique position is that it has dealt with the scars of its Nazi past, but modern racism still thrives. While progress has been made, the deep-rooted prejudices against minorities, particularly migrants and non-European ethnic groups, show that the journey to an equitable society is far from over. Can Germany reconcile its progressive ideals with the realities of racial injustice, or will its legacy continue to be one of contradictions? Country 2. Poland. Poland, a nation with a complex history, has recently seen a rise in nationalism and xenophobia. While government reports suggest low levels of reported hate crimes, on the ground, the story is different. Foreigners, especially those from Africa and the Middle East, are increasingly the targets of racial abuse. Verbal assaults, physical attacks, and daily microaggressions have become common, particularly in cities like Bydgoszcz and Torun, where international students often bear the brunt of this hostility. One of the most disturbing trends in Poland is the government's lukewarm response to these incidents. Many victims of racially motivated attacks feel abandoned by law enforcement, who either fail to act or do not take these issues seriously. This inaction, coupled with rising nationalist movements, creates a hostile environment for non-Polish residents and visitors. Foreigners are often reminded that Poland is for Poles, a sentiment that's gaining traction among the younger population. This wave of xenophobia is particularly concerning because Poland once prided itself on being a crossroads of cultures. But as nationalism rises, Poland's identity seems to be shifting, and its reputation as a welcoming country is slowly eroding. The question remains, can Poland push back against this tide of racism and nationalism, or is this a sign of things to come? Country 3. Russia. Russia is a country of contradictions when it comes to race. On the international stage, Russia often positions itself as an ally to African nations, but within its own borders, racism and xenophobia are rampant. People of African descent, along with Central Asians and other minorities, frequently face discrimination, violence, and hostility. Recent incidents, such as the death of a Zambian student during the war in Ukraine, have brought international attention to Russia's deep-seated racial problems. The racial tensions in Russia are fueled by a rise in extreme nationalism, where minorities are often blamed for the country's economic and social issues. While the government promotes anti-imperialist rhetoric abroad, at home, it does little to protect its minority populations. Many African and Central Asian residents report being targeted for harassment and violence, often with little to no intervention from law enforcement. Despite Russia's historical claims of being an anti-colonial power, the reality for minorities living in the country tells a different story. The contradiction between Russia's foreign policy and its domestic racial dynamics is stark, and it raises serious questions about the country's future. Can Russia reconcile its nationalist identity with the growing demands for racial equality, or will these divisions continue to deepen? Country 4. Hungary. Hungary's stance on immigration has garnered significant international attention. and not for the right reasons. Under Prime Minister Viktor Orban's leadership, Hungary has taken a hardline approach against migrants, particularly those from non-European backgrounds. The government has implemented strict border controls and aggressively pushed anti-immigrant rhetoric. This has fostered an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, where immigrants and refugees are seen as threats to Hungary's national identity. Racism in Hungary extends beyond policy. It has seeped into everyday life. Migrants and people of color report frequent discrimination and hostility, often feeling unwelcome in a country that once celebrated its role as a bridge between East and West. The government's role in stoking these fears has been widely criticized by human rights organizations, which accuse Hungary of violating international norms regarding the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. As Hungary continues down this path, its reputation as a culturally rich and diverse nation is being overshadowed by its exclusionary policies. Whether Hungary will reverse course or continue to isolate itself from the global community remains to be seen. But for now, it's a country where racism thrives under the guise of nationalism. Country 5. Ukraine. Ukraine's ongoing conflict with Russia has exposed some of the country's deeply rooted racial issues. As millions of Ukrainians flee the war, reports have emerged of Black and Middle Eastern refugees being denied access to transportation and safe passage. These minorities often find themselves pushed aside in favor of white Ukrainians, even as they flee the same dangers. In some cases, Black refugees have reported being forced off trains, while even animals were allowed on board before them. This blatant racial discrimination during a time of crisis has shocked many international observers. Ukraine has positioned itself as a victim of Russian aggression, garnering global support, but its treatment of non-European refugees has drawn significant criticism. The government's response has been inadequate, leaving many to question whether Ukraine is committed to addressing these racial inequalities as it seeks international aid and support. As Ukraine struggles to defend itself from external threats, it also faces the internal challenge of confronting its racial divisions. Whether it can do both at once remains uncertain, but the country's future as a democratic nation depends on how it treats all its citizens and residents, regardless of their race or nationality. Country 6. Italy. Italy is known for its rich history and vibrant culture, but when it comes to racial diversity, the country has significant challenges. Italy has struggled to integrate its growing immigrant population, particularly those from Africa and the Middle East. Racism in Italy is often tied to economic fears, with many Italians blaming immigrants for the country's economic struggles. This has led to an increase in racially motivated attacks, particularly in southern regions where unemployment is high. The rise of far-right political parties has further fueled xenophobia, with politicians openly using anti-immigrant rhetoric to win votes. Migrants report facing daily discrimination, from difficulties finding housing to being subjected to racial slurs in public spaces. Italy's slow response to addressing these issues only exacerbates the problem, leaving many immigrants feeling isolated and unwelcome. Despite these challenges, there are movements within Italy pushing for change. Civil rights organizations are working to combat racism and promote integration, but the road ahead is long. Italy's struggle with racism reflects broader issues across Europe, where economic anxieties and political opportunism often stoke the flames of intolerance. Country 7. Sweden. Sweden is often hailed as a beacon of progressive values, with its robust welfare state and commitment to human rights. Yet, beneath this progressive image lies a more troubling reality. Racial discrimination persists, particularly against non-European immigrants. People of African, Middle Eastern, and Asian descent often face difficulties finding employment, housing, and social acceptance. Even with Sweden's reputation for inclusivity, studies show that non-European applicants are far less likely to be called for job interviews compared to their Swedish counterparts. One of the most concerning aspects of racism in Sweden is its subtlety. While overt racial violence is less common, the microaggressions and systemic barriers faced by minorities create a climate of exclusion. The recent rise of anti-immigrant political parties has also contributed to growing xenophobia, making it harder for Sweden's immigrant communities to feel fully integrated into society. While Sweden continues to promote itself as a model of social democracy, it cannot ignore the racial inequalities that persist. Addressing these issues will require more than just policy changes. It will take a cultural shift in how Swedes view and treat minorities. Will Sweden rise to the challenge, or will it allow these hidden prejudices to fester? Country 8. France. France has long been at the center of discussions about race in Europe. As a former colonial power, France's history is deeply intertwined with issues of racial inequality. Today, that legacy continues to influence the lives of millions of people of African and Middle Eastern descent living in the country. From housing discrimination to police violence, racism in France is pervasive and often overlooked by the government. The rise of far-right movements and politicians like Marine Le Pen has only heightened tensions. These groups often frame immigrants and people of color as threats to the country's identity, stoking fear and division. One of the most visible forms of racism in France is the frequent clashes between minority communities and the police, particularly in impoverished suburban areas, where police brutality against young men of African or Arab descent is a well-documented issue. France has attempted to address racism through various policies, but the country's commitment to the idea of universalism, where everyone is supposedly treated equally regardless of race, often leads to a denial of racial disparities. Critics argue that France's refusal to acknowledge racial identity only serves to perpetuate inequality, as it prevents targeted policies that could help marginalized communities. Despite these challenges, France is also home to strong anti-racism movements that continue to push for equality and justice. However, the road to overcoming its colonial past and addressing modern-day racism will not be easy. France's struggle is a reflection of the broader European dilemma: how to reconcile a progressive image with the realities of racial injustice. Country 9. Switzerland. Switzerland, often associated with neutrality and peace, might come as a surprise on this list. However, the country has its own struggles with racism that are less visible to the international community. Switzerland's racism primarily targets immigrants, particularly those from Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. These communities face discrimination in housing, employment, and even public spaces. The country's strict immigration policies also reflect a larger problem of exclusion. One of the most disturbing aspects of Swiss racism is its impact on the job market. Many reports show that people of color, particularly those with African backgrounds, face significant hurdles in finding employment. Wage disparities, workplace bullying, and an overall hostile environment are common experiences for racial minorities in Switzerland. This has created a divide in a country that prides itself on its democratic values and social cohesion. Switzerland's reputation for being an orderly, neutral state has led many to overlook the racial issues simmering beneath the surface. However, as more people speak out about their experiences with racism, the country is beginning to grapple with these uncomfortable truths. Will Switzerland take meaningful steps to address its racial inequalities, or will it continue to hide behind its peaceful image? Country 10. The United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is another European country that faces ongoing issues with racism, deeply rooted in its colonial past. Despite being a multicultural nation with large immigrant communities, racial inequalities are pervasive. People of African, Caribbean, and South Asian descent regularly report discrimination in various sectors, including education, healthcare, housing, and policing. Racial profiling, particularly through the practice of stop-and-search by police, disproportionately affects Black and South Asian communities. One of the most publicized issues in recent years was the Windrush scandal, where thousands of Caribbean immigrants who had legally settled in the UK decades ago were wrongly detained, denied legal rights, and in some cases, deported. This scandal revealed not only systemic racism within government institutions, but also the broader neglect of minority communities. The rise of populist politics and Brexit has also inflamed racial tensions in the UK. Anti-immigrant rhetoric has become more mainstream, and incidents of hate crimes have surged. Yet, like many countries on this list, the UK also has a strong civil rights movement pushing back against these forces. The challenge for the UK moving forward is whether it can address the legacies of its empire and build a truly inclusive society for its diverse population. As we've seen, racism in Europe is a complex and pervasive issue that spans across both Western and Eastern nations. From Germany to the United Kingdom, racial minorities face significant barriers that impact their daily lives. While some countries have made strides toward addressing these issues, others remain deeply entrenched in xenophobic and nationalist ideologies. What's clear is that no European country is immune to the scourge of racism. Understanding these realities is the first step toward meaningful change. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe to Discovering the Earth for more eye-opening content. Which country's situation surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below.